Hey y'all, welcome to Sandy's Library. I'm Sandy.
And I'm Sara. In today's video, we're going to talk about my great-grandparents' marriage.
Y'all, don't forget about our dogs and the cat. They can be noisy sometimes, so please ignore them. Okay, so let's delve into my grandparents' story. We'll start with how they became reacquainted. And y'all, I'm surprised Aunt Allie didn't take credit for that too. But anyway.
Our half-cousin said there was a sibling rivalry between Sissy and Bud because they fought a lot. However, he doesn't explain what any of these feuds were about, only that she was about 18 when their last feud occurred.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I can't confirm or deny this feud. I do know that by the time I came along, she wasn't as close to Uncle Bud as she was to Uncle Jeff, Aunt Sally, Aunt Julie Bell, Aunt Ina, and Aunt Elsie. Hell, she was closer to her stepbrothers, James and Aubrey Mobley, than she was Uncle Bud. But anyway, according to our half-cousin, she ended up moving over to her sister Julie Bell's house because of this so-called rivalry.
Julia Bell and her husband Jess Grider were living at the old Costin place at the time,
which was located just outside Era city limits going toward Chatham.
This was where Sissy became reacquainted with my great-grandfather Joseph Irwin Phillips, whom everyone called Irvin or J.E. or Judge Phillips. He was working at the sawmill in Eris.
And we'll explain more about the judge part in a bit. But for now, let's get back to their courtship. As the story goes, the way I heard it from them was that Sissy was living with Aunt Julie Bell and her husband Jess Grider at the time. Sissy was about 18, and it was common knowledge within our immediate family that she was living there and not at home because of her stepmother, Jessie. I can understand why our half-cousin didn't want to say that, though. But anyway, as I was told, they courted for about a year, then married on January 9th, 1916 in Webster Parish, Louisiana.
Sissy had just turned 19 on January 5th. He would be 22 in July. This was the first and only marriage for both of them. The ceremony took place near Minden, Louisiana, and was performed by Sissy's uncle, Heman Fuller. My great-grandfather was the son of George Dallas Phillips and Rosanna Catherine Love. They called her Katie. His date of birth was July 4th, 1894, in Waldo, Columbia County, Arkansas.
And y'all, my grandpa was incredibly proud of his birth date. He loved the idea of sharing his birthday with our country. And I do know he worked at the sawmill in Eris in the latter half of its boomtown era. The town of Eris was established in 1898 after the Tremont Lumber Company set up shop in the area and a post office was needed. By 1920, Eris had a population of around 3,000. The town had been plagued by a series of unfortunate accidents, including a tornado in 1920 that nearly destroyed the town. And in 1926, a massive fire laid claim to the boomtown, and it ended up shutting down the sawmill. And thus began the decay of Eris until it was nothing more than a small-town memory of what it used to be by the time I came along in the late 1950s. But I digress. Let's get back to my grandparents' story.
As the story goes, Heman Fuller, Sissy's uncle, performed the ceremony in his living room. A couple of days later, Sissy and Irvin boarded a train for Arkansas. His mother's uncle, Jim Love, had hired him to clerk the store at his sawmill in Dierks, Arkansas. He's not to be confused with his mother, Katie's brother, also Jim Love. Sissy and Irwin lived in Dierks for about 4 months or so until he had a falling out with his uncle.
Grandpa never said what the disagreement was over, just that there was one. And to my dismay, none of us ever thought to ask.
Nevertheless, they did return to Louisiana and were living in Eris when Oliver Dallas was born on September 3rd, 1917. At this time, they were living at the old Costin place, located just outside the current city limits of Eris, going toward Chatham.
Our half-cousin claims that Sissy was pregnant with Oliver when they left Arkansas. All I can say is, if she was, she carried him for like a year and a half. But anyway, it's not clear if Grandpa bought the property from Charlie Costin's father or Marion Bunn, who, by this time, was an old rich guy that everybody called Old Man Bunn.
There was an old log cabin on the property that had a side room attached to it. This is where my great-grandparents lived for a couple of years with little Oliver. This was about the same time that Sissy's stepmother, Jessie, came down with tuberculosis. Naturally, with Sissy's knowledge of medicine and her compassion for the sick, she went to her father's house every day to care for Jessie. She took little Oliver with her. He would play with Sissy's little half-sister, Helene, who was about a year younger than him, maybe a little less.
But what nobody knew at the time was that Helene had picked up what was referred to back then as membrane croup, basically diphtheria. Our half-cousin says nobody knew where Helene had picked up the disease, but I have a theory about that. See, I believe that because Willie had taken Jessie and Helene over to Ruston for several weeks, seeking treatment for Jessie, where they were constantly going to the doctor's office until she was diagnosed. I believe this is where Helene picked up the disease. But anyway, my grandmother, being such a compassionate person and all, took Oliver and went over there to take care of the old bitch. Sissy was a saint, y'all, going down there to take care of Jessie after the way she treated Sissy and the other Williams children. It's more than I would have done. And of course, Aunt Allie puts her 2 cents worth in about those dark times. And let's remember, she was about 12 when this happened. And I'm going to let Sara start this story because Aunt Allie's portrayal of Sissy really upsets me.
During Allie's interview with our half-cousin in 1980, she recalled a day when they were in the Williams kitchen near the fireplace. Sissy was trying to get Oliver to take some castor oil in hopes of fending off the cold that she was hoping he had.
Y'all, back in the day, castor oil was the go-to medicine, and it tasted like crap. So, of course he fought it.
The more Oliver resisted, the more Sissy was determined to get it down him. So she starts spanking Oliver's legs. Allie says, "Oh, Sissy, please don't spank him," and tries to shield his legs from her sister. According to Allie, Sissy replies, "Oh, you crazy thing, I've got to get this medicine down him. He's sort of sick."
Yeah, he was a lot sick, and Sissy knew it. If this conversation did happen, my guess is that because Allie was still so young, Sissy might have downplayed Oliver's condition, thinking Allie had seen enough death lately. 'Cause let's not forget that Sissy and Allie's little half-sister Helene had just died of the same condition that Oliver now had. Sissy knew how close Allie and Helene were. She may have been trying to save her little sister more grief for the time being, because 13 days after Helene died, Oliver followed her. He was roughly 26 months old.
We are, however, grateful that Allie finishes her story by saying that years later, after she was older, she recognized that Sissy wasn't being mean. It was only then that she realized her sister was truly afraid that her precious little boy was going to die, which he did on October 24th, 1919.
And you know, I've always wondered how my life might have turned out differently if Uncle Oliver hadn't died so young. If he hadn't died, then maybe my grandfather wouldn't have gone cold, not allowing the rest of us to get too close to him for fear of losing us the same way he'd lost Oliver. His death impacted our entire family. And we'll talk more about that later. For now, let's get back to Uncle Oliver.
One of our favorite stories about Oliver was said to have happened the summer before he died, so it was probably a couple of months or so before his second birthday, and he was known to be a really smart little kid. It's said that he could speak in full sentences by the time he was a year old, something that's virtually unheard of. And he regularly carried on conversations with just about anyone he came into contact with.
Yeah, kind of like my grandpa. He'd talk to anybody and everybody who'd listen to him. When we'd go into West Monroe and occasionally Monroe, we'd be there all damn day because he'd stop and talk to everybody he knew, which was basically everyone, as he'd been the justice of the peace for decades by the time I came along. But anyway, back to Oliver.
We believe that Oliver's capabilities were probably a bit exaggerated, but it was a common known fact in the community that Oliver was a slick little dude. One day, as the story goes, Sissy was about to set the table for dinner, and that's lunch time for most of us, but all the silverware was missing. Sissy starts panicking. She doesn't understand where their eating utensils have gone to, and she can't fathom anyone coming in and stealing them either. Nevertheless, they are gone.
Sissy's at a loss about what to do, so she goes over to the sawmill in Iris, where my grandfather was working, and tells him what's going on. So he comes back home with her, and they've pretty much torn the place up looking for their missing silverware when Oliver says, "I buried it." He proceeds to take them around the yard, and y'all, it's a big-ass yard out in the country, but he's buried all of the silverware piece by piece in individual holes. And he remembered where he buried them, too. Sissy said she didn't lose a single piece.
When asked why, Oliver said he was hiding it so the Yankees don't steal it. Apparently, Uncle Oliver had been listening to various members of the Fuller clan who loved to tell the story about how much trouble Grandma Fuller's family had with the Yankees during the Civil War.
See, Grandma Fuller's maiden name was Hawkins, and her mother's family owned a plantation in Alabama. And, as fate would have it, karma bit the family on the ass, which resulted in the loss of the family's silver. And if you want to know more about that story, you can find out all about it in the videos about Marion and Belle Fuller. Sara and I are here to report the facts. And the fact is that at roughly 2 years old, Oliver was awfully worried about the Yankees stealing silverware. Which is kind of comical when you think about it, considering the McClamy's history and all. I mean, they were undoubtedly the easiest ancestral line to trace because they were always in trouble. So they left behind a whole slew of court records. But anyway, I'm getting sidetracked. Let's get back on target.
On the night of April 8th, 1920, a tornado ripped through Iris, causing everlasting damage. On the outskirts of town, Irwin and Sissy experienced heavy rains and strong winds that night. Their home and property were left pretty much unharmed by the storm. The town of Iris was not so lucky. The next morning, Irwin went into town and found it in shambles.
Grandpa always told me that they rebuilt the sawmill, but that he didn't feel like they'd taken enough safety precautions. He knew the place was doomed if another fire like the one in 1911 broke out.
It was around that time that Sis and Irwin sold their place outside Iris, relocating to a larger piece of property outside Chatham.
This was also about the time that my grandparents, Sissy's sister Ina and her husband Oscar Sevier, along with Sissy and Ina's brother Heman, all started talking about going up to Aberdeen, Washington, where Oscar was from, the following summer to work in the lucrative lumber industry up there.
By then, Sissy was pregnant with her second child, so they put the trip off for a couple of years. Meanwhile, Catherine Eldred was born October 24th, 1921 in Iris, Louisiana, exactly 2 years to the day of her older brother Oliver's death.
I find that incredibly curious. And yeah, I know that Aunt Catherine liked to tell people that she was born in Washington State, but it's simply not true. My grandparents always said she was born in Louisiana before they went to Washington. And I can't see why they'd lie to me about that. Aunt Catherine had a little bit of Aunt Allie operating in her. She wanted to be born somewhere else because she thought everybody around Iris was just a bunch of hicks. And I mean no disrespect either. That's just what Sissy and Grandpa told me. And the 1930 and 1940 censuses confirm her birthplace as Louisiana too. So, anyway, let's talk about their time in Washington State. Our half-cousin has the wrong dates in his manuscript about this and other events. But Sara and I are going to try to clear this up for the record.
My great-grandfather worked in the logging industry in both Washington and Louisiana. They went to Aberdeen, Washington, along the coast in 1923, and they did save up $1,000 before returning home in 1925.
Sissy always told me that Washington State had beautiful countryside, but she was homesick for her family. Plus, she didn't like how it was always overcast. She said she needed to see the sunshine once in a while.
Sissy did learn how to make rice dressing while she was in Washington, though. She got the recipe from one of the saints at the RLDS church up there.
I loved Sissy's rice dressing, and y'all, I've tried, but I've never been able to replicate it. I can get close to hers in taste, but it's just not the same. And I hate to say this, but nobody's that I've tasted since her death has ever tasted as good as hers. In case y'all haven't guessed already, salvaging family recipes and preserving old family tales wasn't even on my radar back then.
Irwin and Sis returned to Louisiana. They always told my mom that they left Louisiana in 1923 and came back in 1925 with $1,000.
Y'all, I can't see a reason for them to lie to me about that.
When they returned, they moved back to their old farm in Jackson Parish, outside Chatham. This is not the place where my mom grew up. That property was owned by Jim Fuller, Sissy's uncle. Jim's place was located on Highway 34 next to the old Guyton School in Ouachita Parish.
Yep, that's where I grew up. But it would be a couple of years before my grandparents would acquire that property. My grandfather really wanted Jim Fuller's land, though. He always said it had better soil and there was more acreage than the land he owned outside Chatham. So Uncle Jim sold him 80 acres, probably at the persuasive insistence of Grandma Fuller. It was a well-known fact back in my day that Sissy had been Belle Fuller's favorite grandchild. I don't know why, but all of Sissy's siblings and cousins talked about it frequently back in the day.
My great-grandparents farmed and lived on the land on Highway 34, obtained from Uncle Jim Fuller for the rest of their lives. Irwin and Sis sold their land outside Chatham to her brother, Jeff Williams. He and his wife, Molly, remained there for the rest of their lives.
I remember going to see Uncle Jeff and Aunt Molly all the time. She was also my grandfather's first cousin once removed.
Molly's father was Jim Love, the grand uncle back in Arkansas that Irwin had a falling out with back in 1916. Our half-cousin would have you believe that the community built the house on the hill that my mom grew up in.
But that's just not true, y'all. They may have helped with the additions, but the backbone of the house was the train depot from Eris. And they didn't obtain that until 1927, according to my grandparents.
In 1926, the sawmill in Eris had its final tragedy, a massive fire that caused the owners to pack up and leave town. And that was the end of the boomtown Eris. Just a few years earlier, it had a population of more than 1,500 people before the first fire in 1911, and by 1920, some say as many as 3,000 people lived in Eris. By the mid-1920s, the population was about 200, and after the 1926 fire, the train depot closed up shop.
My grandfather loved to brag about how he'd bought the train depot from Eris and had it moved 3 miles into Ouachita Parish for a mere $35. The L-shaped depot consisted of 4 large rooms with a fireplace in between the front 2. An additional 5 rooms and a screened porch were added on to complete the house. Our half-cousin says this was done in 1923, and that's incorrect. They went to Washington in 1923 and returned in 1925. Plus, the train station was in full function until 1926. It didn't shut down until after the Tremont Lumber Company packed up and left town after the 1926 fire. Facts matter.
So anyway, this brings us up to just about the time when my grandmother Florence and her twin brother, Uncle Lawrence, came into the picture.
And we're going to save that event for the next video. So until then,
thanks for joining us today. We'll be back soon with the continuing story of Viola Williams and J.E. Phillips.
Later, Gators.